The now familiar sight of the president as a kind of consoler-in-chief is actually a relatively new role for America's leader, but it has become one of the more important parts of the job.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
When an American president gets it right and in a few words sums up the emotions of a moment of national tragedy, they can help bind the wounds of a grieving country, like Ronald Reagan's soothing eloquence in January 1986 after the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
The words don't even need to be pretty, as long as they seem to come from the heart, like Obama's raw emotion recalling the victims of the Sandy Hook school shooting.
First graders. And from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun.
But sometimes presidents miss the mark. When the moment calls for empathy, they instead manage to project indifference. In August 2005, George W. Bush had been on vacation at his Texas ranch for 27 days. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, 1,000 people were dead, $100 billion worth of damage was done to the Gulf Coast. Bush stayed on holiday for another 2 days before flying back to Washington, taking in an aerial view of the devastation below. Official photos meant to show concern. Instead, it portrayed remoteness. And things only got worse days later when Bush jovially praised the efforts of Michael Brown, the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yeah, and I want to thank you all and Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director's working 24.
Brownie was not doing a heck of a job, and a week later he'd be forced to resign. Bush's approval rating crumbled and never recovered. In October 2017, when President Trump lobbed paper towels at Puerto Rican survivors of Hurricane Maria, to some it looked pretty contemptuous. What to Trump may have seemed playful came across to others as unserious and uncaring. The pageant of the American president in a bomber jacket jetting off to a disaster zone, though, is fairly new, a product of the television and internet age, as well as modern transportation. There's no record of President Ulysses S. Grant travelling to Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871. Teddy Roosevelt didn't wander around the streets of San Francisco after the earthquake in 1906. And after Midwestern tornadoes killed 700 people in 1925, silent Cal Coolidge remained in Washington and silent. In those days, emergency responses to floods, fires, earthquakes and hurricanes were still seen as local matters. People expected their city or state officials and maybe the Red Cross to ride to the rescue, not the federal government in faraway Washington. In 1955, despite more and more Americans getting their news on TVs, President Dwight Eisenhower stayed on holidays through the worst hurricane season to date. But his absence was hardly noticed. It wasn't until a decade later that things started to change.
By mid-afternoon, the presidential plane is on its way from Washington. At 5 o'clock, Air Force One lands at New Orleans.
Lyndon Johnson travelled to Louisiana in the wake of Hurricane Betsy.
The president declares Louisiana and Florida both disaster areas, tells the Office of Emergency Planning to coordinate federal assistance.
His trip was covered live and considered a huge political success. It was a time when the federal government was exerting more control over the states in areas like desegregation, civil rights and emergency management. Local authorities had too often turned a blind eye to disasters, particularly ones that affected racial minorities the most. As consoler-in-chief, though, it was probably Bill Clinton who set the new standard in 1995. Not after a natural disaster, but a man-made one.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, shattering that building, killing children, killing federal employees, military men, and civilians.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens.
It was an attack on the government itself. A federal office building was the target of the bombers, and Clinton's empathetic response probably saved his presidency, which was reeling after major midterm losses. It helped to form an emotional bond that not even subsequent scandals and an impeachment could break. And ultimately, that is why presidents make a beeline to the scenes of natural disasters and other tragedies today. It's not only expected of them, politically, it can pay huge dividends, assuming they don't mess it up.